This module will focus on the ignition system tune-up techniques. We'll discuss ways to help your customers get everything they need on the first trip to the store and tips for performing great tune-ups. After watching modules 1 and 2, you should have a good understanding of how to recommend the right spark plug for your customers' engines. But let's do a quick recap, because spark plug selection is critical to a successful tune-up. For an older car with a conventional ignition, a copper core spark plug is the standard offering. The Autolite XP Extreme Performance Iridium Enhanced Fine Wire Spark Plug would be an upgrade. For a modern car with a DIS or coil pack type ignition, an Autolite Double Platinum plug is the standard offering, and the Autolite XP Spark Plug would be an upgrade. For a modern car with a conventional coil-on plug ignition, an Autolite Single Platinum Spark Plug is the standard offering. And again, the Autolite XP Spark Plug would be an upgrade. In fact, most of these types of ignitions now use fine wire iridium enhanced spark plugs as original equipment. So what's next? What else does your customer need to do the job right and get their car running smoothly? Let's start with the spark plug wires. It's a good practice to offer your customers new spark plug wires as well. You might wonder why, since all they came in for was spark plugs and they just want to do a simple tune-up. But the fact is, many spark plug wire boots are very close to the exhaust manifolds. The extreme heat can bake the plug boot to the spark plug. Since they're difficult to remove, they will often tear or crack when taken off. It can also be very difficult to remove and install the spark plugs themselves, so this is the perfect time to replace the spark plug wires as well. We've seen many instances where someone installs new plugs, but they crack or tear the boots during the installation. This can result in misfires due to the damaged boot. They will usually blame the spark plugs for the problem because they didn't notice that the wires had been damaged. So what about an engine with a coil-on plug ignition? They don't need new spark plug wires, right? Wrong. These engines have a rubber boot connecting the coil to the spark plug. These also reside in a high heat area, and they can become brittle or crack from the heat. Another issue with coil-on plug boots is they can become oil-soaked due to a leaking valve cover gasket. If your customer has a coil-on plug ignition, take the time to ask if they're replacing the spark plugs due to misfires. If so, ask about the spark plug wire boots. Are they oil-soaked? If they are, recommend that they replace the leaking valve cover gasket as well. You also need to consider coil near plug applications, a very popular variety of coil-on plug ignition that is used by a large volume manufacturer. It's called coil near plug. This is the same as a coil-on plug ignition, except that it has a short spark plug wire connecting the coils to the plugs. These can literally become welded to the spark plugs due to heat from the exhaust manifolds. Do your customers a favor and recommend new spark plug wires for this type of ignition. So we've covered spark plugs and spark plug wires. Now is a good time to make sure your customer has all the right tools for the job. Make sure your customer has a good spark plug socket. A model with a rubber liner inside will help protect the insulator from cracking. They'll also need a good ratchet and several extensions. It's also important for your customer to check the gap of their new spark plugs. Many plugs come from the factory pre-gapped to the most popular gap for that particular plug. But that doesn't mean it's the correct gap for their vehicle. In some cases, the vehicle manufacturer will change the recommended gap after releasing the vehicle into production. Your customer should always check the latest information in their vehicle's service manual. This is a very popular gap gauge, mainly due to its low cost. The problem with this gauge is that it's most often used incorrectly. With the exception of copper core spark plugs, all of today's plugs have precious metal electrodes. These can be easily damaged by placing an object between the electrodes and prying them open. The correct way to use this gauge is to use the small circle to grip the end of the side electrode. Then pry open the gap or tap the side wire to close the gap. You use the sliding scale to measure the plug gap. Another popular and more accurate gap gauge is this style. It has round wires to accurately measure the plug gaps. It also has a tool attached for opening and closing up the gap. A tune-up should start with the customer closely reviewing their vehicle's service manual for spark plug removal and installation instructions. Now I know some of you might be questioning this advice. After all, installing spark plugs is an easy job, right? Not always. For example, some transversely mounted V6 engines require the removal of the upper intake manifold to get to the spark plugs in the rear. On this particular model, some coolant lines need to be disconnected and the manifold has to be removed. Knowing this in advance allows you to make sure you have extra coolant and the manifold gasket, plus the extra time and tools. Other engines can be even more complex and require very detailed instructions for both removal and installation. We'll cover this in more detail in a future module. The engine should be cold before you start removing the spark plugs. A couple reasons for this advice. If the plugs and cylinder heads are the same temperature, it will help in removing the spark plugs. It also prevents burns from the hot exhaust manifolds. Then use a shop vacuum or compressed air to clean the area around the spark plug. This keeps dirt and crud from falling into the engine. When removing the spark plugs, use caution as carbon can build up on the threads, causing them to be difficult to remove. Work the plug back and forth if necessary to remove it. With our gapped spark plugs ready to install, that brings up an important point. Some people like to put anti-seize on the spark plug threads to prevent them from sticking in the engine. However, most manufacturers recommend not using anti-seize on spark plug threads. Anti-seize product has many great uses, but when placed on spark plug threads, it can actually change the heat transfer of the contact point between the plug and the cylinder head. This point is called the motor seat. If metallic-based anti-seize gets between the motor seat and the cylinder head, it can change the heat transfer, effectively changing the heat range of the spark plug. If you do decide to use anti-seize, use it sparingly. Avoid getting it on the motor seat area of the spark plug. When installing the spark plugs in the engine, it's best to use a torque wrench and tighten them to the OE factory torque specifications. This assures proper contact between the plug and the cylinder head. When placing the spark plug boot back on the spark plug, a little dab of silicone dielectric grease is very helpful. It seals the connection from weather and corrosion, and it helps when removing the boot the next time around. With a fresh set of spark plugs and wires installed, there are a few more important parts needed to finish the job. On a modern engine, a complete tune-up should also include replacement of the fuel filter. This will ensure an adequate supply of clean fuel to keep the injectors working well. A high-quality air filter should be installed to maximize performance and help the engine breathe better. All of the belts should be inspected and then replaced if they appear to be cracked or worn. Lastly, a good fuel system cleaner can be helpful in making the car run its best. As you've seen, a good tune-up includes much more than just swapping out the spark plugs. Make sure your customer has everything they need to do the job right the first time, and help them avoid additional trips back to the store. They will appreciate your knowledge, your expertise, and will look to you for advice again in the future. We hope that you've gained some valuable information about spark plugs and ignition systems that you can use when working with your customers.